Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast. Today, Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh joins us. Robyn Faith Walsh is an associate professor at the University of Miami. She earned her PhD at Brown University in Religions of the Ancient Mediterranean with a focus on early Christianity, ancient Judaism, and Roman archaeology. Before becoming professor at the University of Miami, she taught at Wheaton College, the College of the Holy Cross, and received teaching certificates and pedagogical training at Brown University and Harvard University. She teaches courses on the New Testament, Greco-Roman literature, and material culture. Today's topic will center on her book, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, Contextualizing the New Testament within Greco-Roman Literary Culture. The link to purchase her book is in the description below. I highly recommend it. I enjoy reading it myself. Okay, so thank you for joining me, Professor Walsh.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So my first question, what were the central points that you could summarize for the audience that persuaded you that an elite class within the Roman culture, in the context of Greco-Roman culture, had written the Gospels, and not just some poor guys in Galilee somewhere, like a lot of other people tend to think?
Well, I think there are two ways that I could begin to answer that. I should clarify to start that by elite culture, I don't necessarily mean somebody who has a lot of money. And I think it's always important to say that up front, because sometimes I think we map present day concerns or ideas or ways that we deploy certain kinds of vocabulary and retrospect, do some kind of, anachronistic application to antiquity. But the people who are elite in this case, or what I consider elite culture or elite persons within a particular, stratum of culture, are those who have access to what's called paideia, so advanced education in the ancient world. And the number of people who actually had that kind of advanced education was really, really narrow. And, scholars disagree on numbers, and some of it has to do with what do we mean by literacy. If you can sign your name and maybe kind of, write graffiti on the wall outside a brothel, are you are you literate? Or somebody who can actually write complicated prose narrative, which is what we find in the Gospels. The Gospels are certainly not the highest level of elite writing in the ancient world. Anybody who has read them can see they're fairly simply constructed sentences, even in translation. Although the concepts are really complicated, but there's still a really good effort by somebody who's had a pretty advanced education. So someone who's culturally elite in antiquity could come from a number of different places in terms of those, a certain, those strata of antiquity that I'm thinking about. So somebody, say, who was enslaved, who was educated, could, for the purposes of educating children, say, in a household, that's somebody who could also be elite. So the reason I thought that we needed to revisit the question of who wrote these Gospels, because we do, as you say, have kind of this image in our head of, these Galilean peasants, kind of huddled in the attic after the death of Christ, trying to preserve stories about his life, was really because of that statistic that I just referenced, this idea that this was such a limited number of people in antiquity who had this kind of education, who had these means. Even on a practical level, to get paper and pens, or what we would consider paper and pen, papyri and ink, and to circulate these writings. Coming from a classics background, which I did, there are so many other kinds of what you might call imperial literature written around 1st, 2nd century, with similar themes, similar ideas in them as the Gospels. The Gospels seem very much like the kind of Greco-Roman literature produced in these centuries. And in other fields, we know that they were produced by people who are part of that kind of elite class. So that's what I wanted to look at. What would it mean if the Gospels were produced like any other kind of ancient Greco-Roman literature, produced by people who were more culturally elite, more highly educated, and maybe, the influence of the content of the Gospels might be, the more formative influence might be that kind of elite class of other writers who are producing, reading, circulating works than the oral tradition of an early Christian community.
Do you think that Paul's letters are written by a highly educated person, the authentic letters of Paul?
Well, Paul is certainly highly educated. He's often considered what's called a Middle Platonist. That wasn't a term from antiquity. but he's somebody who's steeped in Greco-Roman philosophy. He's reading the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And he's using his knowledge of paideia, of, Platonic sources. And also he seems to be imbued with certain Stoic physics. He's aware of that as well. And he's combining that Platonism and Stoicism into what's sometimes called this middle period, this middle Platonism, to describe things like the word we use for spirit, how the spirit, Holy Spirit functions, and his idea of how, one can, as he puts it, participate in Christ. So he's clearly highly educated. He clearly is, I think, someone of some means. He often talks about, at points in one of his letters, he'll say, see, I'm writing in my own hand, and I use these big letters. There's a scholar named Canada Moss who has worked on this recently. It seems as though he may be using scribes or other kinds of, maybe even enslaved workers to help him write his letters, which is the activity of elite persons of means. So on the economic level, he seems to at least have access to elite kind of mechanisms for writing and producing his letters, and individually, given his the education levels that he displays, he's certainly culturally elite and knows quite a bit about Greco-Roman philosophy, not to mention the Hebrew Bible, of course.
I remember that in the book you also talk about Greek literary parallels to the New Testament with writers like Pythagoras' golden verses, and also other Stoic ideals. Did they take that and did they try to were they basically retrofitting Hellenistic ideas such as what I just mentioned and trying to fix it trying to fit it into some sort of Reformed Judaism in that way?
Well, there's a big tradition in this period, and I'm thinking here of Josephus and Philo, especially, who take some of these Greco-Roman materials that are so popular across the ancient Mediterranean, and there's a little bit of competition going on. You can see in some of these other Jewish writers in first and second into the 2nd century and beyond, really. This is not exclusive to them, but I'm thinking about Paul's context. A little bit of, oh, well, you think, Plato's so great? Well, Moses said this way, way before. So there's a little bit of, just competition and trying to figure out, where did these culturally important ideas or intellectually important ideas, if you're trying to locate their genesis, I think that's certainly a factor among some Jewish writers who, again, are being educated in that traditional Greco-Roman way and familiar with all of these philosophers, with Homer and with these other, and with, as you mentioned, other kinds of literary tropes and training. I think there's a little bit of competition going on, a little bit of one-upsmanship, you might say.
Now that you bring up Josephus, I have to ask about the dating of the Gospels. I know that in the book you don't really talk about the dating, but because of that, I wanted to ask if you're open to the idea that the 4 Gospels are 2nd century, because because there are some people that argue, well, many argue now that Luke actually is Josephus, but there are some scholars, as I'm sure you are most likely aware, that that they say they take it to the next mile and they say actually all 4 of them copy Josephus in the 2nd century.
Yeah, I've heard that. There are further arguments that are starting to develop in the field. And I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the one scholar who's written on this most recently. If it comes to me, I will say it to make sure I give people adequate credit. But there's been more of a movement to say, well, could these have been written in the 2nd century to satisfy debates among the church fathers or, the later church about the origins of Christianity or about, certain theological issues that are raised later on. I'm not sure about that argument. It's something I'll have to look more into. So I can't say that I can speak. It's not something I've researched in depth, just, things that I've been reading. But I am open to the idea of looking at the gospel dating again. I think that at minimum, when I have to teach Intro to the New Testament and I have to teach, well, Mark is exactly 70, and Matthew is exactly 10 years later, and Luke is exactly 10 years later. And then I get into the debates about where does John go. Certainly, my students struggle with that more and more over the generation. And maybe that's my own skepticism starts to kind of leak through. I try to be very neutral when I teach, but maybe they can kind of detect that I don't have as much passion as maybe I should to defend that idea, that like, oh, well, Mark 13 means that this is written basically, while they're watching the temple burn. I just can't, I can't quite settle with that timeline and how neat it is, because as you could probably tell from the book, I like to re-examine all of our assumptions, going into, and that's a big one, because it does strike me that we kind of create this little ladder to go back to origin, and that's the issue too with the concept of Q, right? Because in the absence of this gap between say 30 and 70, these all dates are sort of general anyway here, except for the fall of the temple, but let's say Jesus dies around 30. To get past those, two generations, one long generation, to come up with the idea of layers and oral tradition and something like Q as well, extends that ladder and ends up creating a mechanism by which to justify an idea of continuity that there's just no evidence for it, other than I think our aspirations for there to be a simple way to justify some of what the mythology around the origins of these texts and who's created them. And it's not that I think that we should wholesale throw all of this out, but I do think it's worthy of a re-examination at least.
Yeah, there are actually two scholars I recently interviewed that think that the four Gospels are second century and copying Josephus, and their names are Professor Marcus Svensson, and the other one.
That's who it is. I just remembered his name too, but I didn't want to interrupt you. But yeah, that's one. Yeah.
And the other one is Bartosz Adam Szynski. And his vision is it's very similar to Vincent's, but it's also a bit different here on certain aspects of it. With Vincent, he goes with the four Gospels written around like the late 130s, early 140s, centering around Marcion's activity. But Dr. Adam Szynski thinks Mark is probably around 100, and Luke. He says Luke is actually the second Gospel, and Matthew is the third one. It's a Matthean posteriority hypothesis that Dr. McEwen also talks about. He thinks that Luke is the second Gospel, but he goes with more consensus dating. I also interviewed him recently as well. Now, this is one question I'm definitely want to ask you about, and in the context of what you're saying about the New Testament fitting in the idea about the elite culture of highly educated people. Do you happen to be familiar with, this is a very controversial theory, and there's a couple of scholars that hold this, even Vincent himself has become a bit convinced of it recently. Are you familiar with Roman provenance by any chance?
With Roman provenance for the Gospels?
Yeah, have you ever heard of that?
Why don't you tell me, just to make sure that I don't start talking about something that's not relevant.
Yeah, it's someone like Professor Eisenman holds that position, that the New Testament appears to be like pro-Roman propaganda written by Hellenistic Jews. They're like, yeah, we need to try to convince everybody that this stuff is, the Messiah is really a pacifist. He's not really this warlord we all thought he was going to be. Kind of something somewhat similar to what Josephus is saying. Oh, Vespasian is actually the Messiah. What would you think about that?
So Roman provenance, in the sense that these are probably part of some kind of Roman citizenry or Roman elite or something like that. Not that they were written in Rome. That's the thing I wanted to make sure that I got, or written in Rome. Right. I know there's a long tradition too of, Mark being written in Rome under Petrine auspices or something along those lines. And I think that some of that kind of historical reconstruction that both tries to tie the Gospels to certain figures of Christian origins shows actually a consciousness of maybe some of these things are Roman, in the sense that we would consider, to define Roman here, just to make sure that we're clear, is that it's not just, like before we were saying somebody from, say, Judea, only concerned with, the idea of Jesus Christ being, this Jewish Messiah, and only reflecting on things related to Judaism in the Hebrew Bible. So I think that I definitely agree that whoever is writing these texts, I try to maintain in my work a cognizance of what's often called the Judaism-Hellenism divide, this idea that there's the Roman world, and then there are the Jewish people, and then later Christianity, and these things should be cognitively divided in our minds. That's a little bit repetitive, but we should keep these things into separate categories in our minds because they're so distinct. I don't think that. I think the Greco-Roman world, even Judaism and Christianity, it may seem odd to some people, but they are Hellenistic religions. They are Greco-Roman religions in that respect. So I think that when we talk about something like Roman provenance for the Gospels, what we're really saying is that we can recognize that these are normal Greco-Roman texts that have an interest in Judaism. That's not unimaginable, especially in the first century, especially in the aftermath of the Jewish war. There's good reason to comment on the relationship between, or a relationship in these texts to Rome. But I do think that there is, whether it's Roman sympathy or something else, I am sympathetic to the idea that these texts are themselves what we might call Roman, in the sense that, again, they're displaying Roman education, Roman themes relating to Roman literature. They're just also interested in Judaism, which is itself also under the auspices of Rome.
I know you also talk about the Q document in the book, and there are some scholars like the late Burton L. Mack that thinks that, okay, well, Q went through like 3 stages, so in the context of that, do you think it started out as a very lower educated document that was eventually modified by highly educated people, or do you think it was always elitist from the get-go?
That one's really hard. There was actually a chapter in this book about Q that I removed. And in that chapter, I argued that there wasn't a compelling reason to divide Q into layers in the first place. Because in my experience, at least reading around literature, and you cite one scholar here, there's a tendency to say, well, here's one theme. That theme is representative of a community. And so this one community wrote everything having to do with this one theme, right? So if there's something about, so each individual Q community represents one discrete interest, and that this text is layered with those interests, and that by identifying those communities, you can then, again, date the text by saying that there are these layers, you date them backwards, and then next thing you know, I think I sort of quip somewhere in the book, you're at the foot of the cross, like if you can go back far enough with the oral tradition. My problem with that is that it very much looks like the critique that I bring to bear in chapter 2 of the book, which is that our tendency to both imagine communities as so cohesive and discrete that they only would think to write about one particular topic is problematic. And this idea that also text can represent communities or represent oral speech, that assumption, I think is also problematic, and an approach to the Gospels that I think has been influenced quite a bit by scholarship of the 19th century, which we can talk about later if you'd like, but I'll leave it there only to say that Q, I think, as an artifact of many of the critiques that I have about not assuming that these materials are being written by an author, that is an issue. There are scholars who have argued, and I don't think it's gotten much traction, that Q is, because we don't have it. There are many scholars who just don't even want to talk about it. This thing doesn't exist, so why are we talking about a thing that doesn't exist? Yes, we've put it together and reconstructed it, but it's still just a theory. So I'm not quite in that camp fully. And not to sound like I don't like to make decisions, I'm kind of keeping up in each camp, but I found compelling some scholars who were playing with the idea that, Q in a way is sort of, maybe what you might call like a romantic fantasy about how to reconstruct early Christian history on the basis of oral tradition. because by reconstructing this text that's missing and then claiming it's from communities and from oral speech, then you've translated that nebulous category of oral tradition into something concrete that can be discussed and analyzed and compared. And so again, kind of fall into the methodologies that we're most comfortable with in the field. So I think there's a good reason to also be a little hesitant to automatically accept the idea that Q can be layered, that there are multiple Q communities. I know scholars like Bill Arnell have argued that there may be evidence that Q is written by scribes, maybe somewhere in Galilee. So just enough education to be able to maybe put together a saying source. I don't want to misrepresent his work, so you should have him on to talk more about it. But I am a little bit skeptical of the idea that scribes would also construct a text like this, like the one that we reconstruct in Q. Only because that's a lot of work. That's a lot of steps for me. And maybe I'm just not imaginative enough, but it's a lot of steps for me to imagine reconstructing Q, imagining communities behind Q, layering Q, ascribing it to scribes, assuming the scribes have a certain education, and there are reasons to think about, my idea, back to your first question of, who is elite, right? Who's elite enough to write these things? There may have been scribes who were educated enough, and we see this in what's called scholia. Sometimes we have scribes kind of, writing little notes on the side of their work to say that many of them are, have an advanced literacy. But there are also many scribes who are just trained to copy what they've been given to copy. And so it's really hard to kind of project onto those figures a certain level of education without, I think, a lot more research.
What led you to the conclusion that it's possible that Christians actually didn't write the Gospels?
Well, this is something that I've been a little surprised that people have taken away from the book. Because what I say in the book is that I'm interested in what's the most formative group that we can attribute the content of the Gospels to. And by content of the Gospels, I mean a few things. I mean the genre of the Gospels, the source material it seems to draw from, including, I argue, elements of, say, maybe even the Greek novel. This is more obvious in something like the Gospel of Luke, where you have like shipwrecks and that kind of thing. The genre of biography in the ancient world. And so those genres are very well defined in antiquity, in the sense that, you have certain expectations, genre expectations that you have to meet. And the Gospels do that. And so, long story short, the thing that I'm trying to say there is that from content to genre to even form, the way that it's written in Koine Greek, that these are, and then again, the idea of how is it produced? What are the practical elements? Who has enough training, money, resources to even get papyri, to get ink, all of those things, and then to publish? What does publishing look like? We often talk about these things being written and then poof, they're just out in the world. And we don't think about what are the practical aspects for these things to circulate. By positing something like a Christian community circulating them, that does a lot of work. By just saying these are written by and for communities, we never have to think about how these things are circulated as published works, right? Because we just assume they're in that kind of intra-Christian bubble, and that bubble just takes care of it, right? So that's how it's preserved and passed along, and nobody else is reading it. And I'm trying to challenge that by saying the more formative community is not that Christian community, but the community of people who trained whoever wrote this thing to write. So other writers. So what I say in the book is that, sure, I'm sure whoever wrote this knew some Christians, right? I think I say that once or twice, because it would be awfully strange to just decide to write. I can imagine a world in which someone's like, I've heard about Jesus. This is a really interesting figure. Say somebody in the circle of Pliny and Trajan, right? Because we know in that letter, they're sort of like, who's this group, that's within our midst? They call themselves Christians. What do we know about them? You can imagine an elite person curious about that subject, especially in the aftermath of the Jewish war. I'm not going quite that far. I'm just saying that, sure, this author probably knows some Christians, but is it the Christian community that's telling him what to write? Or is it, and I assume he, because most authors are men in this period, Or is it the people who trained this person to write, the things that he's reading, the other people he's exchanging texts with, the people who will accept this text as a published work? Because what I see in the Synoptics especially, which is why I focus on the Synoptics in the book, is a literary exchange. Like let's go with the traditional model, Marcus first, then Matthew, then Luke. What you have there are three authors writing about the same subject and basically like using one another, but maybe disagreeing with one another. So if you abandon the idea that there must be an oral tradition, and that's the genesis for these three stories, which is strategically a very interesting claim to make, what you're saying there is that not this oral tradition must absolutely be the case because there are three independent verifications of the same story and they must have come from the same origin point. I call that an early Christian Big Bang in the book. There has to be this early Christian Big Bang. Jesus came, everybody memorized everything he said. They passed it on faithfully for 2 generations until these 3 independent witnesses wrote it down. What you actually have are 3 authors stealing from one another. You could say Matthew reads Mark and goes, where's the Hebrew Bible in that? There's not enough there's not enough stoicism in this. There's not enough, evaluation. Jesus, this character, he's too esoteric. He's the new Moses. Let's put, you can see how these authors just acted like authors. And so that to me seems to be the more formative way to imagine a community, if you want to use that word, inspiring the content of the Gospels.
Since you say that the Gospels fit a Greco-Roman elite context better than just a Jewish Galilean poor context, are you suggesting that do you think the 4 Gospels are based more firmly upon Hellenistic literature or that of Jewish literature, or is it equal, or vice versa?
It's hard to do kind of a percentage. I focused in the book on Greco-Roman only because I feel like, it's really quite practical. I don't have a lot of evidence as a historian for education systems within, say, how Pharisees are educated. We just don't know a lot. We know more later on, but we don't know a ton about that subject. There's an author named Catherine Hetzer who's written about Jewish literacy in Roman Palestine. She actually, if I recall, and again, everybody should double check me on these things because it's off the top of my head because I didn't know what you were going to ask me before coming. But I think she's in that 4% range for literacy in antiquity. No more than 10%, I think, at most. So we have some data that we can compile, but for the most part, these texts, I think, because they look so much like other Greco-Roman literature, just interested in, the Hebrew Bible and those subjects, add that to it. I think there are traditions of Jewish literature that also work within this paradigm. I would also say that these are texts that are written in that ancient Mediterranean context in which you have to factor in the fact that it is under the Roman Empire. So back to your question about, Roman provenance, there's a we might say melting pot in this period where there are going to be multiple forms of inspiration, or at least, if I shouldn't use inspiration, information for how to put these things together. And the fact that they're written in Koine Greek, the fact that they are citing what seem to be predominant lines of Greco-Roman philosophy in the 1st century, I don't think that you can say, again, a percentage one or the other, but certainly knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures is vitally important to those texts, as it was for Paul, and as it was, I think, for the Jesus movement, obviously, from the beginning.
What do you think about Paul in his letter to the Romans? He mentions that, greetings to Orestes, the treasurer, this treasurer in Rome, and they even found this inscription. Archaeologists found this inscription with his name written on it, apparently. Would you say that fits what you're saying about the elite context? Because look at that, the Roman treasurer himself already in Paul's time as a Christian, and he obviously is an elitist.
A few things on that. First, I would highly recommend John Kloppenborg's new book on Christ associations. It's quite good, in terms of breaking down the evidence we have for the word we call ecclesia, we call church, the word ecclesia in Greek, because that word was in operation long before Paul picked it up to describe what we would call the Christian church. And these were associations of, citizens in different locations, locales, who banded together. Often it was around some kind of profession. And they basically acted almost like, I always think of like a 4-H club or something like that, or almost like a little insurance club. They had a deity that was often, at the center of these ecclesia, and they had certain patrons who helped, move it along. But you would pay your dues, and if something happened to your family, they would be there to support you, or to be there, if, worst case scenario, somebody passes away, to help with burial and things like that. So these associations existed, these ecclesia existed around the empire, and Paul's adopting that language or co-opting that language and applying it to the groups he's trying to form with these letters. Now, with the Romans, of course, he never met them. Well, maybe he did eventually, but when he wrote that letter, he hadn't yet. He was writing a letter of introduction to try to get sponsorship to come to Rome. And actually, he asked to go to Spain as well to talk more about this ecclesia that he's forming at that point around the eastern part of the Mediterranean. He's showing ambitions to go to the west. You're not going to ask for sponsorship from people who aren't able to sponsor you. You're not going to ask for support, financial support, and support to begin an ecclesia if you're not writing to people who have the means to help you begin this ecclesia and to take certain leadership positions in the ecclesia. And we know that there were certain kinds of economic exchange as part of these groups. Actually, when I teach Paul, whether I teach a seminar on Paul or when I teach New Testament courses, I begin with Romans, because I know it's what people tend to say, quote unquote, mature theology. But what it is it's an intellectual and spiritual CV. He's giving you his resume. He really lays out, how he understands his activity to be justified and what he's looking for. And so I do agree that, it may not be that everyone in an ecclesia, and we certainly know this because it included people who were of lesser means or people who were part of a household who were enslaved. But right. He is looking for people to help make this thing run. And to do that, you do need people who are more financially able to do so. So I think he is definitely looking among the classes of people. I always get a little nervous when I say class, because I always think we map, kind of a like post-capitalist system in our mind. So again, just with all my cautions about what I mean by class and elitism, but these are going to be people of means who are going to be able to help him with his activity.
And would you say that would fit in the context of Acts when Paul has frequent contact in Acts of the Apostles of high-level Roman officials, going from like the garrison commander Claudius Lysias all the way up to people like Felix and such, Governor Felix and such and such?
It's an excellent question. One thing that Kloppenborg says in the book that I just referenced is that we don't have any evidence, I think, until the 2nd century of anyone from the Roman senatorial class being a Christian. So there's this interesting gap where you don't have anyone of the, let's say, native aristocracy or, this truly elite class, both in that case, culturally and economically, who are ascribing to this new system of Paul's, or to any Christ associations later on. Now, that may just be a paucity of evidence. It's hard to say. And we do know that there are, other, like sometimes I say to my students, other games in town. Paul's not the only person going around looking for sponsorship for his ideas. And not the only person claiming to have divination experiences of deities and looking for sponsorship for that. Jennifer Isle has written a great book on this, on Paul and divination, most recently. And I think also an interesting source to compare, to think about the social situation you're describing is, although it's satire, so it has to be treated, carefully, is Lucian, because Lucian often talks about, Peregrinus and, other kinds of, self-styled philosophers. There's this one man, Alexander, who says that he is basically a steward of the god Glycon, and, he actually is fairly well educated. We know he can write in verse because he sometimes writes, little predictions in verse and like hides them in like a serpent egg. And then, but he is a Roman senator sponsoring him. So the idea that, like, would we call that Roman senator who's sponsoring him, a Glycon worshiper? Maybe, or an Alexander worshiper? Maybe. There would be some terminology, but the idea that you could have these people who are claiming a certain authority because of their connection to a god or their interpretive abilities, looking for sponsorship among the senatorial class, I think that's pretty common trade for the 1st and 2nd century. So I don't think Paul's quite outside of that.
And just to be certain, that's you're referring to Lucian of Samosata, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And speaking on senators, do you think that it is possible, and I know you pretty much stated earlier that we really don't have evidence of high-level high-level Romans being Christians, with the obvious exception of Orestes, the treasurer. Do you think it's possible that there was a Christian senator, we just don't know about him, that could have existed, and therefore could someone like him speculatively, tentatively have written one of the Gospels? Do you think that's possible in your mind?
So I'll give if I say yes, I'll give two caveats to that. The first is that I don't think it's impossible in these first centuries for someone to be Christian right, or Christian curious. I don't think that's impossible. And even by using the term Christian, whose version of Christianity? I tend to resist the idea that Christianity was incredibly diverse in the early centuries, just based on our evidence. But diverse meaning, populous, that there are multiple kinds of Christianity. I think that's a later theological problem. But, there can be people other than Paul who are representing a certain vision of the significance of Christ from Judea, right? This Christ Jesus from Judea. So I think there could be some people who are curious about it, but still maybe are going, they're worshiping the emperor the way that they should, because if they're a senator, they want to stay alive. Or, so they're participating in emperor cults. They're participating, like best barbecue in antiquity was to participate in, an animal sacrifice. So they may still be eating meat to idols, we might say. They may be still doing their thing. But also are interested, like sampling something maybe from this other interesting new cult outside of, coming from Judea. I think that's totally possible. So I think we have to move away from this idea that once someone became a Christian, it was a wholesale conversion and that's it, because I don't think that's sociologically how people tend to function, right? There's a transition period, right, to maybe going into a wholesale conversion, to use, our turning, in English we say conversion to another kind of religious affiliation. So I think that that's totally possible. And then if we say that a Roman senator, quote unquote, wrote the Gospels, I'm not sure the guy's doing it himself. I think in that case, again, I'll cite the work of Candida Moss, who's been working on this and has published a couple of recent articles on the subject of enslaved workers, producing some of this literature. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. While some elite people who, spend their time being philosophers and writers in antiquity describe themselves, going to the library by themselves and poring over books and writing, it's actually quite a physically and, laborious process. We're not talking about like typing on a computer or, like writing in a notebook. We're talking about, large scrolls and codices. And so this is something that Moss has worked on. This is a lot of physical labor and not labor that these rich senators are probably likely to do themselves. So it brings up a question of authorship to some extent, if you're thinking about who's actually producing these things in that respect. And so I recognize that. So that would be the only, but there's still, authorship going on. There's still an author in that case to the text. And so I think we just want to be really, again, conscious of when we think about processes, what those processes may have looked like. So I wouldn't say that Roman Senator Bob, converted to Christianity and wrote a text. So I'm just trying to trouble that a little bit to say, if we make that, there wouldn't have been a Bob, like Bobius. That's not a name. But you see what I mean. I don't think somebody would have done the labor themselves, but they may have dictated the labor.
Are you also open to the dating of Paul's letters possibly being later as well? Because I think, if I remember correctly, in the book, you also seem to be, you don't really get into the exact dating of Paul's letters as well. I ask because I've been noticing there's a slow growth of scholars, movement of scholars that are growing. Like, the dating of Paul may be wrong, and that, by the way, also includes Professor Vincent, who I mentioned earlier. He thinks that.
I think that the work of people like Brent Nongbury too has been helpful in this area, because I think we need to think quite a bit about what we mean when we talk about the texts that are compiled into the New Testament as texts. When were they put together? Because the texts that you read in the Bible, we don't have what's called autograph copies. This is not something that, it's not like we have like the original one, the original version of the letter to the Romans, and this is what it said. What we have in our Bibles is a Frankenstein's monster of different passages that have been taken from multiple papyri and other sources that have survived antiquity, and then based on a series of criteria scholars have put together to say this is our best bet for what it probably looked like, right? So that brings up a question of all of these texts that we analyze. We don't have the original, so how much can we say about them? Now, one thing that I try to be careful about in the book, two things. One was saying, acknowledging this fact still doesn't mean there wasn't some text that we call marked, that did exist, that then was copied, published, and then, because of scribal error or, human intervention, changed in various regions or over time, right? This is why I'm interested in the book too, in the concept of authorship. And I talk quite a bit about Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, actually, because I fear that as a guild, when we start to say that, oh, well, if, there are multiple versions of a text that we then compile into one version of the text, then there is no author, or if there are multiple people who had to be involved in the publishing of a book, it would almost be like saying, like the book that you held up at the beginning, like, well, somebody else bound that book. I didn't do it personally. So am I like there's a copy editor who changed some stuff in there, so does that mean I'm no longer the author because, somebody, right? So I worry about that sometimes we get a little too extreme when we say, okay, well, there was a process here. There's more than one person involved. We don't have the copy in their original handwriting. Therefore, there's no author. I think that's a mistake that we make with these materials that we have to be careful about, because then you allow that slippage of, so then it must just be oral and therefore there's nothing we can say about this text, right? That's an extreme caricature of the situation, but it's one that I'm worried about. So with Paul, I think that there's definitely a concern. I mean, we know we don't have all the letters. We know that there's a good chance that something like 2 Corinthians did not look like that at all, that might be multiple letters that have been put together to seem cohesive. We also know that there were forgeries that, what we might call forgeries that circulated in early codices and early quote unquote canons that were letters that were impersonations of Paul. So I think Paul's writing before the war, personally, just based on my reading of his, again, quote unquote, theology. So, but that's kind of a separate question from, when were these letters compiled in the way that they were and circulated? That's an interesting question that I'm glad people are questioning, but I'm not quite ready to put Paul, I don't know, super late. I think he's before the war.
In the Epistle to the Philippians, Paul references his apparent access to the imperial guard of some kind at Caesar's household, or he mentions greetings to Caesar's household, and he also mentions Epaphroditus. There are some, such as Professor Eisman, that think that the Epaphroditus that Paul mentions is the same one Josephus dedicated his Antiquities to. There are also some other early Christians that seem to think that Titus Flavius Clemens and Clement of Rome are also the same guy. But the question I'm really asking is, do you think because I know that some people argue that, oh, well, when Paul is referring to Caesar's household, he's not really talking about Caesar's household. Do you think that Paul was literally referring to Caesar's household in his letter to the Philippians?
I think there's, again, good reason to look at this for a particular reason that I bring up. I think it's in chapter 3 of the book. It might be later. I'm getting further away from the book now, so it's harder for me to remember. It's in either chapter 3 or 4, where I talk about the shared motifs and themes between the Gospels and the text called the Satyricon. And in that discussion, I point out that there are scholars, and this kind of fits what we've been talking about the last few questions. There's a long tradition that the Satyricon was written by a Petronius who was in the household of Nero. And then in recent years, there's one scholar named Ulrike Roth who had published a couple of articles in the Classical Quarterly pointing out that there are a number of people named within the letters of Pliny that are also named in the Satyricon. And this is the same Pliny writing to Trajan about Christians. And so I took that and suggested that, well, what would happen if we imagined that the author of Satyricon, and actually kind of doesn't matter if the author is from the 1st century or the 2nd century, but what if we're talking about here by looking at things like you're talking about the names and reimagining, because if we get away from this idea that the Gospels had to only be produced, again, by, it's the oral tradition of an illiterate, Galilean peasant class, to look at this idea of like, let's re-examine these names. If so few people are actually writing, I know we're missing, the majority of writings from antiquity, but on the off chance that maybe we see some social connections here in social networks, I don't know that we've done proper social networking for early Christianity for the reason of our own assumptions about who produced these texts, right? So in my argument about Pliny and the Satyricon, this is, again, same Pliny writing to Trajan. Some people in this particular social network, they're thinking about Christians, and curious about them, or at the very least aware of them. Who else can we add into that social sphere of those particular elite Romans, and that can connect you back to Rome. And so then if you start to look at these networks and these names, I think it could do a lot of interesting work to see that this is something that is impacting not just these lower rungs of society as we've traditionally imagined. So I know I'm not directly answering your question, sidestepping it a little bit, because I haven't read it in a way towards that particular kind of conclusion that you're asking about, but it's something I've touched upon, and I do think it's a worthy endeavor to look at those things in more detail.
Well, thank you for joining me today. This has been a very fascinating conversation, and and if you're willing, I would certainly like to have you back again at some point down the line.
Always happy to come and talk about this stuff. I do it all day.
Thanks again.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.